Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our talks with Walt. We are in starting from Paumanok, section number 6 out of 19 sections. This is one of the longer sections of starting from Paumanok, and along with passages 12 and 14. And so we're going to maybe pay attention to why this one needs to be a little bit longer. The other thing I want to point out is the way in which passage 6 is a continuation of passage 5. Now these are, again, as we've said, go back to learnstrong.net and those early lectures. We've already given lectures in that folder called Talks with Walt. All of the inscriptions, 24 poems. I want you to especially go back and review Eidolons, especially our comments from Plato's Republic and the idea of his dualism, that idea that there is in fact a body but there is also a soul. This will be foundational to our reading of passage 6. And as well, I want to make sure that you have worked with all of our previous lectures on starting from Paumanok, beginning of course with our intro lecture all the way through and including passage 5, which we said was one of the more radical. In some ways, you get a sense that 5 and 6, passages 5 and 6 of starting from Paumanok, is when Whitman decided, in the deathbed edition, of which I hope you have a version in front of you, that Whitman decided he was going to kind of swing for the fences. And you get a real sense of his intentionality. We call this often the I will poem, because we have over 16 times the phrase I will, the intentionality of Whitman here. Now, normally we like to read the entire poem and then come back to annotate. But because of the length, I'm going to go ahead and just start right away. Now remember that the last lines of 5 were the here, spirituality, the translatress, the openly avowed, the ever-tending, the finale of visible forms, the satisfier after due long waiting, now advancing. Yes, here comes my mistress, the soul. And we talked about the kind of radical language of calling your soul a mistress and all of this kind of thing. And then right away, we jump right into passage 6. And he begins with the exact same words that he finished passage 5 with, the soul. Notice the comma, and then he will begin to muse. Forever and forever. Then notice the use of the dashes here that will remind us of Emily Dickinson. Longer than soil is brown and solid. An interesting line, given that the title of this collection is Leaves of Grass. Longer than water ebbs and flows. Now this ebbing and flowing we're going to come back to. Again, as we've said, one of the reasons we're spending so much time with these early poems is so we can read Song of Myself. We spend so much time reading Song of Myself so that we can then read the rest of Leaves of Grass. Once you've read all of the poems in Leaves of Grass, you will begin to pick up on the intentionality, I'm going to mention it here now, the intentionality of Whitman's compositional project, as we'll think about it, what he will call my book, right? In inscriptions, you'll remember it's this book that he hopes will remain in the libraries alongside all of the great masters. Notice he'll say about the soul that it's forever and forever, longer than water ebbs and flows. All of that Darwinian evolutionary ideas are obviously created here. Speaking of creation, then we will begin with the I will mantra. Now pay attention to the power of repetition. I will, I will, I will. We'll even ask at the end of our discussion here, as we work at 3B, what is it that you will? What is it that you desire? And of course, right away, we have to think about writers at 3A like Schopenhauer and The World is Will and talk about the power of will. Notice the intentionality here. What is it that he wants to do? Notice the repetition of the word poems. We're going to see this over and over again, right? I will make the poems of materials. In other words, physicality. For I think they are to be the most spiritual poems. Now, go back to what we said in Eidolons. Go back to what we've said about Plato's Republic, especially books 6 and 7 in the cave allegory. And that idea that there is 2 worlds that Plato's always wanting us to see. The world of the physical, related to the 5 senses, but everything in that world sags and bags, as we say. Everything has to go away. You can't swing at the park forever. The van is always waiting. But there is a second domain. There is that world that is not physical, but metaphysical. But notice here what Whitman has said. I'm going to take the information from the first box to go back to that earlier Platonic lecture, and I'm going to create the stuff of the second box through the first box. Go back to what we say, for example, about Donne's valediction forbidding mourning, very similar kind of idea. And he says, I will make the poems of my body, very physical, and mortality. In other words, I'm going to be a poet that will speak to both boxes profoundly, okay? For, he says, I think, here's our epistemological fallibilism, I think I shall then supply myself, and notice the I shall is just a reinvention of I will, right? I shall supply myself, we're setting ourselves already up for the song of myself, with the poems of my soul and of immortality. In other words, yes, of course, as all the transcendentalists of his time, although Emerson didn't, as we've said in earlier lectures on Emerson, he didn't necessarily like the term transcendentalism, he liked idealism better. That is to say, those ideas that are a part of the Platonic second box. Notice that Whitman here will argue, I'm going to get to the second box, but I'm going to get there through something as silly as the smell of armpits, as we'll see later in some of the lines from Song of Myself. And then he continues. And again, notice this repetition of I will. I will make a song of these states. Now, we've already seen this in the inscriptions a number of times. Go back and look at those poems. That no one state may under any circumstance, underline that phrase, be subjected to another state. Obviously, we have questions and issues regarding the Civil War as we read lines like this. And I will make a song that there shall be comity, harmony. Think about Plato's ultimate goal in Republic, right? Comedy by day and by night between all the states and between any two of them. Whitman, the great unifier, hoping, praying for some sense of unification, as of course the Civil War proved otherwise, right? And he continues, I'll make a song for the ears of the president full of weapons with menacing points, and behind the weapons, countless dissatisfied faces. Now, this is some amazing stuff. Let's break this one down. First of all, he says, I'm going to make a song for the ears of the president. I hear America singing, now we're back to ears. But notice the use of the word president. Because depending upon when this poem is being constructed, and it was constructed over a period of time from 1860 when it was originally written, and think about then, of course, who was the president then, right? We've got Buchanan and Lincoln. And it culminates in 1881. And this poem is being edited throughout all of those years, right? Those 20 years that are so crucial to our reading it. Think about it. From Lincoln to Johnson to Grant to Hayes to ultimately Garfield, who, of course, like Lincoln, is assassinated. So notice here his use of the word president. And look what he says he's going to say to the president. I'm going to sing a song full of weapons with menacing points. Now, we can't help but think of bayonets when we hear this menacing points, but we're also, Whitman, the philosopher, like Socrates, is a point man, a pointer, I'm directing you, and of course, a gadfly at the same time, because he loved that image of Socrates as gadfly, right? And then we have several lines here that were added into Leaves of Grass in 1867. I told you this is a work in progress that will in some ways very much compare with stanza 11 from Seadrift, the poem Pioneers, O Pioneers. Let's read and then we'll come back to take a look at it. And behind the weapons, countless dissatisfied faces. This is one of the things we love about Whitman's theodicy. He doesn't, but many people want to try and claim, like they like to claim of Emerson and Thoreau, that they were kind of blind optimists who were always singing about how amazing the world is in spite of the fact of all the pain, suffering of the world. Whitman, like Emerson and Thoreau, does not disavow the pain and the suffering of the world, which is why his theodicy is to say, no longer ask, why did this happen to me, but rather, why did this happen for me? These dissatisfied faces, of course, have something to do with the fact that Americans have always been disgruntled with the fact that their government doesn't always produce what it has promised. Notice, he says, and a song make I, notice the inversion of I will make, of the one, notice it's capitalized, formed out of all, the fanged and glittering one, whose head is over all, resolute, warlike one, including and over all. And then notice the use of the parenthetics, however high the head of any else That head is over all. What head could he be talking about? Well, this is where we use text to read text. And here in Pioneers, O Pioneers, we're going to hear something about a fanged and warlike mistress. And it's actually a flag that he's talking about waving over the whole warlike procession. In other words, notice that his song, here Whitman, the politician, Whitman the patriot, his song will be like the flag that unites all of us in our diversity, in our complicated warlike diversity, at times warlike diversity. He says, we're all one. Notice the repetition of the three ones, one formed out of all, one whose head is over all, one including and over all, and then finally a repetition of the head that is over all. He's not talking about an individual, clearly. He's not talking about a president. He's talking about the symbol of our oneness or our togetherness, of course, the flag. And then he continues. I will acknowledge, and as we said, Whitman is pedagogue, Whitman is instructor, is always trying to play this game of who and what he will acknowledge. Go back to our opening lines of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, where he'll play a similar kind of game. I will acknowledge contemporary lands. That is to say, I'm aware that we are a nation with other nations surrounding us. I will trail, it's an interesting verb, the whole geography of the globe. When we get to Passage to India, we'll talk about that it is true that Whitman has this certain kind of exclusivist, exceptionalist view of America, but he's also got this amazing inclusivist view that the world is what matters, and we're going to hear this here. I'm going to trail the whole geography of the globe and salute courteously every city, large and small, and employments. Notice the exclamation point. I will put in my poems, notice this is the fifth use of the word poems here, that with you is heroism upon land and sea. By the way, notice this you, which is kind of a vague antecedent of a kind. This heroism is, of course, a key concept. We've already seen this multiplicity of times in our study of inscriptions. Whitman, great lover of the Iliad and the Odyssey, great lover of Virgil's Aeneid, great lover of the idea of heroism. But notice he will translate the idea of Achilles or Odysseus or Aeneas as heroes to the American people themselves, and his poetry will celebrate this heroism. Notice the you here then will be the reader, no doubt, but it'll also be all of us as Americans, and then of course even as world readers. And he continues, I will report, as opposed to earlier acknowledge, all heroism from an American point of view. Now, let's say three things really quickly about that. First of all, we've already said it from our study in inscriptions. I hear America singing. Go back and look at that lecture. Whitman does not use the word America, Americano, a couple of sections ago. He doesn't use this word very often. It's almost as if the word America is for Whitman so reverential that he only uses it periodically through Leaves of Grass. When he uses it, we want to sit up and take notes. Number two, notice he says that he's going to report all heroism from an American point of view. Now this is of course the exceptionalism that will be at the heart what Whitman is all about. America is special. The question of the day, as we said in earlier lectures, was, where is America's great epic? The Greeks, of course, have their two epics. The Romans had, of course, the Aeneid. England, of course, had Paradise Lost. And, of course, the Italians had the Divine Comedy. Where is the great epic? And the answer that Whitman will give is, we don't have a great epic. We are the epic, the American people. We write our own poem. We are the poem, as opposed to some poem about us. Having said that, notice he will qualify Leaves of Grass as the mirror into which that epic poem America will look and see themselves reflected, and to that degree I'm going to report all of this as heroism. Then we will have a number of I wills that are shortened lines here. I will sing the song of companionship, no question. That collectivism, that idea of we're all in this together. We're all friends, even though, of course, it is, as he said earlier, that whole thing of menacing points, right? Okay. I'll show, notice it's acknowledge, then it's report, now it's show. I will show what? What alone must finally compact these. Now, the word these, I mean, study the way in which you have these interesting pronouns in Leaves of Grass, and you're not always clear what the antecedent is. what is it these? Is he talking about his poems? Is he talking about the states? Is he talking about Americans? I mean, exactly what is the antecedent to the pronoun these? Finally, compact these, that is to say, bring them all together, the great unifier. And then instead of I will, it's I believe. I believe these are to found their own ideal of, and then he uses this word, manly love. We're going to see this again and again throughout the Leaves of Grass, indicating it in me. In other words, the symbiotic relationship between Whitman as poet, Whitman as American, and of course Whitman's audience that will be American by and large, but of course he was also aware that he had an international audience that was reading his stuff. I will therefore, notice it's almost as if he's building an argument here with all these I wills. I will therefore let flame, one of the central images, and of course very profoundly about the phoenix, right, that bird that will inflame itself and then resurrect out of the flames. I will therefore let flame from me the burning fires, and think about our final lines of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, where he says it so beautifully that he wants to send those embers, those thoughts, out into the future to us, of course. If winter come, can spring be far behind, is the way that that one will end. I will let flame from me the burning fires that were threatening to consume me. It's almost as if, now we're in the prophetic tradition, right? You go back to Pushkin's Prophet is a classic exemplar of this. That idea that there's this stuff inside of me, he says, that was just going to burn me up if I didn't have some kind of release. Leaves of Grass will be that release, and I will share my ideas then with you, whoever you is, right? He says, I will lift what has too long kept down those smoldering fires. Now this word lift is an important word for us. I mean, it's the idea that I'm going to resurrect, I'm going to lift. And of course, a story like the Good Samaritan story in the Gospels of someone injured who needs to be lifted up, brought up. We're playing, obviously, that game as well. He continues, I will give them complete abandonment. That is to say, no restraint. And this is, of course, fascinating when we study our Whitman, that he wants to be disciplined, but he also wants to be unrestrained. How can one be both at the same time? Whitman says, I'm gonna figure out a way to do it. He says, I will write the evangel, notice the hyphened word, the evangel poem of comrades and of love. Now we're going to get to Whitman and religion. We haven't spent a lot of time talking yet about Whitman and religion, although we mentioned it in Eidolons. We're going to get to it later, but here already, notice he says, I'm going to write the evangel poem. And by the way, this is the 6th reference to the word poem here, of what? Comrades and of love. He's going to talk a lot about love later. And you could make the argument that what makes Whitman such a great poet is that he's unafraid to talk about love. He will not dodge it. He will come right at it. This is, makes us think of our Leo Buscaglia, of course, and his great texts on love, and his great talking about love. He says, I'm going to talk about comrades and love. And then he asks 2 interesting rhetorical questions, which he writes them as if this is self-evidently, obviously, there's an obvious answer. We're going to have to debate whether it's so obvious. Who but I should understand love with all its sorrows, all its sorrow and joy, right? He sees both sides of the confusion, the complication that is love. And who but I should be the poet of comrades. And here we are one more time identifying himself with the poet. Notice ending with 2 rhetorical questions after so many of these I will, I will, I will, I will. In other words, I'm going to do what no one has done before, sounding very, very much, of course, like his hero Milton in Paradise Lost, things unattempted yet in prose and rhyme. Go back to our lectures on that at learnstrong.net. He says, I'm going to do something that's never been accomplished before, and why shouldn't I? I mean, who else is better suited to do this than am I? Well, let's finish at 2a. Obviously, one of the major messages of this section is that the artist must be intentional and focused if the artist is going to be able to accomplish his or her rhetorical mission, right? At 2b, again, we've talked about these repetitions and the power of these repetitions. I will, I will, I will. We'll notice how through Leaves of Grass he plays this game. At 3a, there's so many texts that we can relate to this one, but I'm just going to mention 2 vital ones, I think, in the mind of Whitman himself. One is obviously Virgil's Aeneid, a text that we have lectured almost line by line at learnstrong.net. Go back and look at those lectures again, especially the introductory lectures. What is Virgil about? Well, he's going to write the poem for the Romans. He's going to tell their, if you will, Plymouth Rock story. Where did we come from? Oh yeah, we came from this cat named Aeneas who escaped Troy, and that's why we're the greatest nation in the world. I think Whitman has very much some of that idea in his own understanding of what he's about to do. And then I've mentioned it already, but it bears repeating. Shelley's Ode to the West Wind is such an influential text for Whitman. I mean, he even mentions Whitman in this poem, several of those allusions to Ode to the West Wind, the fire especially I'm thinking of. Finally, at 3b, a couple of questions to help you own this section here. What was a time that your focus was unbelievably intentional? For example, what is your I will right now? What is that for you? That thing that says, I'm going to do this. Because obviously, we think about that, to be or not to be passage from Shakespeare's Hamlet, conscience makes cowards of us all. Go back to those lines and the way that we talk about the ways in which we make up our mind to do stuff, and then we kind of don't do it. Notice this idea that you got to start by saying what it is you're going to do. What is that one for you right now? Maybe for some of you, it's finishing all of the poems of Lisa Grass. But before we can do that, let's get through starting from Paumanok. Of course, passage 7 is coming next, right? 13 to go. Thank you.